Hello and welcome into the GSMC Sports Podcast brought to you by the GSMC Sports Network. I'm your host, TJ Mabardi. Happy Friday. Today is April 12th and we have tons to catch up on from the breaking news of this week. We're going to be starting out the show by going over some of the details that have been released surrounding the theft of Shohei Ohtani from his interpreter, Ippei Mitsuhara. So we're going to be diving into some of the timeline there and just talking about the crazy story as a whole. Then we are going to get into the topic of Kentucky basketball hiring their new head coach, Mark Pope, to a 5-year deal and finding Calipari's replacement and what it means for the program moving forward. Then we are going to be talking a couple different contract extensions from Jrue Holiday, re-signing with the Boston Celtics through the next handful of years, and Josh Allen returning to the Jaguars as they look to try and bounce back from last season. But before we get into the show today, just a reminder to like, follow, subscribe wherever you keep up with us. For our live viewers, be sure to use the comment section to help make this show as interactive as possible. Give us your thoughts on all of the biggest stories in sports. And if you would consider leaving a tip or donation, you can use the link that is streaming across the bottom ticker. That is gsmcpodcast.net. Anything would be greatly appreciated. Now getting into the situation surrounding Shohei Ohtani and Ippei Mitsuhara, where we had some federal investigators sort of come out yesterday and update the public on a lot of the details surrounding this case. It was about a month or so ago when this story first started coming out as the MLB season was coming to a beginning, when Ippei Mitsuhara was being accused of, quote, a massive theft of at least $4.5 million from Shohei Ohtani. Since then, we found out that $4.5 million was, putting it lightly, he was actually at least $16 million from Ohtani's account to these illegal bookmaking operations in California that Mitsuhara was a part of, and he is now formally being charged with bank fraud after a federal investigation determined that he was involved in illegal wire transfers and impersonating Shohei Ohtani to the bank itself, and all kinds of misdoings that are likely going to end up him sitting in a prison cell for the foreseeable future. The court case is supposed to take place in the next few days, though, so we're not going to have the full results of all of this just yet, but I wanted to sort of talk everything through on where things currently stand in this case. This all happened, of course, as the Dodgers kicked off their season against the San Diego Padres. They were in Korea when federal investigators sort of looked into this illegal bookmaking operation in California, and Shohei Ohtani's name was attached to a couple wire transfers that sparked big-time outrage around really not just the MLB community, but the sports community as a whole. And as the investigators started looking into it, Ippei Mitsuhara stepped up and said that he was responsible. Now, he didn't say that he was responsible until at first he took full acknowledgement of the fact that he was gambling, but at first he said that Shohei Ohtani was aware of this and helped him to pay it off. Since then, though, he has recanted that statement, and as things sort of looked, as this investigation was starting off, it was looking into whether or not Shohei Ohtani did have any knowledge of this situation as a whole. And as things currently stand, Ohtani is being labeled as a victim. So some of the details surrounding this case: Mitsuhara placed approximately 19,000 bets from November of 2021 to January of 2024, with that rate, people are pointing to the fact that that would mean Mitsuhara was being involved in 25 bets a day. The average wager was 12.8 thousand, and he lost a total of 40.7 million. Definitely goes to show how dangerous gambling can be as an addiction. But Mitsuhara in this situation was connected to one of the biggest stars in the sports world in Shohei Ohtani, who had more than enough money to cover his debts. But not just that, was somebody who very much relied on Mitsuhara for his everyday life. And considering the fact that Ohtani does not speak very much English, and Mitsuhara was with him everywhere, they developed a very close personal relationship, which is why this came as such a shock to Ohtani and was such a backstabbing. But again, federal investigators made it very clear that Ohtani is the victim in this situation. Mitsuhara is being charged, and we'll sort of dive into the logistics of how he was able to pull all of this off. But Martin Estrada, the attorney of the Central District of California, said, quote, "There is no evidence to indicate that Mr. Ohtani authorized the over $16 million of transfers from his bank account to the bookmakers." And I know that there are going to be a lot of people who are sort of running with conspiracy theories about how this is a fall guy situation and that Ohtani is actually guilty in all of this. So we're just going to lay out the details, because it was very confusing even when we first started talking about this situation. I still believe that Ohtani was innocent, but a lot of things weren't lining up from the timeline of how this all played out, from the conflicting statements of Mitsuhara when he first talked to investigators, and the pure fact of how do you not notice $4.5 million stolen, let alone $16 million. So, Ohtani won't be going through. The idea that if Ohtani wasn't going to go through with charging Mitsuhara would mean that he was guilty, that he didn't want Mitsuhara to go to court and speak in front of law enforcers and potentially get himself caught. That was something that a lot of people were pointing to. There were a lot of questions about whether or not Ohtani would go through with actually charging Mitsuhara. Now that is the case, and for no matter how much money really in these fall guy situations, Mitsuhara is looking at a potential jail sentence of 30 years. Now, it's likely going to be less time than that, but still, I don't think that Mitsuhara would be willing to sort of face this type of punishment just in order to cover up a situation here for gambling debts if Ohtani was involved with that. The FBI also does not care about the reputation of the MLB. I know that there are going to be people out there talking about how this is a cover-up situation. The reality is this federal investigative crew is not worrying about whether or not the MLB's reputation is going to be harmed by this. The whole reason they got involved with this was to take down an illegal bookmaking operation for this man with the last name of Boyer in California, where sports gambling is illegal, and they happen to stumble into this big time name of Shohei Ohtani. The FBI wouldn't cover things up in this situation. They have nothing to benefit from the MLB's reputation being upheld. So I think that the investigators are legitimately doing everything they can to sort of get to the bottom of this. And as things currently stand, based off of the way that they have found out information over this time, it does appear that Ohtani is the victim. So wanted to talk about the order of events a little bit, because one of the biggest questions is, well, how did Mitsuhara have that type of power over Ohtani's bank account? It was reported, or found out, I should say, that Mitsuhara actually helped Ohtani set up his bank account back in 2018 when Ohtani joined the Angels, came overseas, and Mitsuhara helped set up that first bank account where Ohtani's salary went to. And Mitsuhara, quote, refused to give access to the account to the rest of Ohtani's other professional advisors, including his agent, accountant, and financial advisor, telling them Ohtani wanted to keep that account private, which is another example, specifically when you look at that last point where Mitsuhara told, and maybe at the time Ohtani did legitimately want to keep the account private, but it's an example of the type of power that Mitsuhara had over Ohtani because of the fact that there was the language barrier and these other people couldn't directly speak to Ohtani in full without Mitsuhara being a part of it. Mitsuhara then met Boyer at a poker game in 2021 and got under his sports book, started gambling later that year. He changed the contact information then at some point along the lines on Ohtani's bank account to link the account to Mitsuhara's phone number and an email address that Mitsuhara had control of. The FBI even recovered phone calls between Mitsuhara and Ohtani's bank where Mitsuhara pretended to be Ohtani and approved these massive wire transfers. Ohtani was fully cooperative in his own right to cooperate with this investigation, answered all the questions investigators were looking at. He gave up his phone to be searched by the FBI. They didn't find anything that would indicate he knew anything about these wire transfers. And now Mitsuhara is facing up to 30 years in prison. So obviously a ton going on in this type of a situation. Now it sort of does, again, unless any crazy twist were to take place during the court hearing, it seems like this is now sort of less a story about Shohei Ohtani and more about Ippei Mitsuhara. The MLB does have the option, if they do find anything suspicious about the story and how this plays out, they can further look into the situation surrounding Ohtani. If you are, again, one of these conspiracy theorists that talks about a cover-up, this is a situation where I find it very hard to believe that the MLB is going to do any real further investigation on the situation because they absolutely benefit from the reputation of Shohei Ohtani, the league's biggest star. But as for the FBI, they really have no incentive to try and protect somebody like Shohei Ohtani. So the lying and the covering up would have to come from Ippei Mitsuhara himself, who is now potentially facing this amount of jail time. And I think that it is very unlikely that he would be willing to go through a sentence for, again, maximum is 30. Let's even call it 10, 15 years. I think that that is a very unlikely situation that he would be willing to serve that time if he were not guilty in this situation. He is currently pleading guilty to the sequence of events. Again, we're going to have more stories coming out. He's going to be tried in Los Angeles, and we'll have some more stories coming out from there. But again, this was one of the more shocking stories that have taken place in recent time, and it does seem like Ohtani is going to be off the hook, which, again, is absolutely a good thing for the MLB. And really, if you're a fan of baseball and sports, it's pretty weird, I think, how many people were sort of hoping that Ohtani would be guilty in all of this. Now, again, I'm not saying you were wrong necessarily for having questions when this first came out, because it was a very messy story at the beginning, but sort of as we get all these details and everything is coming out in full, I do believe that we have to believe what the FBI has sort of put out there. It does go to speak, again, the sort of dangers of having these other people surrounding professional athletes, especially ones who have a language barrier, and what type of power they can have over an athlete. I'm sure this is going to be a little bit of a cautionary tale for the next handful of years, especially considering the fact that Ohtani and Mitsuhara were supposedly as close as they were, seeming to be best friends, and this was all going on in the background. Extremely damaging. Now, again, I say damaging. Ohtani at least has a massive amount of money that typically, if they get $16 million stolen from them, that can be, the sky is falling, your life is falling apart. For Ohtani, who just signed a $700 million deal, clearly it is, strange to some degree that Ohtani didn't notice, but also the way that Mitsuhara went into the account to not allow Ohtani to get notifications about any of these big-time wire transfers. The fact that from the bank's perspective, they had a phone call with Ohtani who approved all of these massive transfers, so they didn't have to sort of take any secondary measures to make sure that this was legitimate, because Mitsuhara was pretending to be Ohtani during these phone calls. That whatever, I don't know if the details of the bank themselves have been fully released in terms of where it was, but they got to be feeling pretty bad about themselves that they were able to be tricked over like this, and I'm sure some of their security procedures are going to be changing going forward. But let me know what you think about this situation as a whole. I do think that it is a great thing that Ohtani should be able to just move on from this situation, focus on playing baseball and being one of the best athletes in the world, really. But we're going to be taking our first break here, and when we come back on the other side, we will be diving into the news that broke last night about Kentucky hiring Mark Pope as their next head coach. So stick with us, and we will be right back.
I feel like I'm losing my mind. Is everybody in the world blind? Please, Lord, give me a sign, a sign. I feel like I'm losing my mind. Is everybody in the world blind? Please, Lord, give me a sign, a sign. I wanna be the greatest. Everybody on the fake shit. I look around and feel like everybody is the fakest. I make this every day and I'm impatient, hoping one day I blow up from the basement. Statement, the top is so vacant. I don't hear shit that I think is amazing. Waiting for my day when I'm playing sold out shows for 1,000 faces. Hey, give me that crown, get in my way and to be put down. It ain't your place, all this my town. If I want that shit, then I'll get it right now. I'm losing it, the noose it fits, some losing shit, a stupid myth. You choose to live or choose to dip, you choose to fight or lose your grip and lose a gift. I feel like I'm losing my mind. Is everybody in the world blind? Please, Lord, give me a sign, a sign. I feel like I'm losing my mind. Is everybody in the world blind?
Welcome back into the GSMC Sports Podcast. We just finished up talking about the theft of Shohei Ohtani and what it means in the big picture, but now we are going to be switching gears into the breaking news from last night that Kentucky has hired Mark Pope to be their next head coach of the program. Of course, coming in the wake of John Calipari leaving for Arkansas, Kentucky gets a fresh start, and they come in with a familiar face in Pope, who spent his college years playing for Kentucky, was a member of that 1996 national championship team. So we're going to be diving into sort of what this means for the program moving forward. Pope has spent the last 5 years as the head coach of BYU, taking the Cougars to the NCAA tournament twice. That includes this past season, where they put together a really good regular season in the program's first season in the Big 12 after moving from the West Coast Conference. They ended up bringing in a 6 seed, but they were upset by Duquesne in the first round. So a very solid season for BYU, but very disappointing end to it that I know a lot of people are going to be pointing to in terms of this hire for one of the biggest college sports programs really in the country across all sports. And he also spent 4 years at Utah Valley as their coach, turned the program around from 11-19 the year prior to him joining the program, and then improved each season into a 25-win team by his fourth season, and then took the BYU job. But like I mentioned, Pope actually graduated from Kentucky and was a captain of their 1996 championship team. Pope is known for being a high-energy person, confident and energetic, and this does bode well for the type of job that needs to be done at Lexington, where it is absolutely a pressure cooker there, and you need to be able to have the personality to sort of rise above all of that pressure, and it does seem like Pope can probably handle that, but time will see on that part. Last season at BYU, he ran a little bit of a similar offense to Kentucky in that it was NBA style. It was a lot of emphasis on the three-point line. The issue is the dribble drive stuff, or the drive and kick stuff that Calipari ran at Kentucky. BYU was much less acquitted to actually attack the rim itself, which was ultimately a little bit of the reason why they ended up falling short in the tournament, because they had been so centric around the three-point line. Duquesne ran them off that, and it took them just a little bit too long to adjust to that. So can make a point for a little bit of coaching concern in that type of situation where the team wasn't prepared necessarily to adapt in that situation as quickly as they needed to. But again, I'm not trying to take too strongly of a side just yet. We're going to have to see how he plays out there in Kentucky, but it is a 5-year contract worth about $5.5 million annually. It's going to be one of the most expensive head coaching contracts in the sport. And that being said, for that type of money, it is a slightly underwhelming hire in terms of, news breaking, attention grabbing names that were thrown out there before. Dan Hurley of UConn, of course, Scott Drew of Baylor, and Nate Oates of Alabama were all some of the biggest names that were on their search list. Hurley was never going to go to Kentucky one way or another. He laughed off that idea at the podium when he was asked about it earlier this week. But the other two in Jrue and Oates, they had at least supposedly considered the position, but both turned it down as well. Another name that was thrown out there in terms of being a splash hire that Mitch Barnhart, their athletic director, actually was not willing to aggressively pursue was Billy Donovan. Donovan is the coach that, of course, led Florida to back-to-back championships in 2006 and 2007. He is now with the Chicago Bulls in the NBA, currently trying to make a playoff push or in the play-in tournament and have a chance to come out of that to make the playoffs, although not super likely that they will be able to actually make it into one of those 7-8 seeds, but we will see there. Donovan hasn't been in college basketball since 2015, so perhaps Barnhart, didn't know if Donovan would be able to adjust to this new landscape in college athletics with the NIL era and everything. I would say that it's almost a little bit more transactional like it is in the NBA. Has, of course, NBA experience, so in terms of selling himself to be able to elevate prospects to the next level with a brand like Kentucky behind him, maybe that would have worked out there. But also there's a chance that Barnhart didn't want to prolong this coaching search for another week or so, depending on how the Bulls finish out their season and when they do, but it could end next week when the play-in tournaments wrap up. So it's not like he was going to likely have to wait months to fill this position. More likely than not, it would have just been a week, but that is another sort of factor that could have played in here, as Barnhart is under a little bit of pressure himself based off of the way that things have played out at Kentucky these past couple decades here. Rick Pitino was another name that was thrown out there into the potential of Kentucky bringing in. Pitino spent 8 seasons with Kentucky from 1989 to 1997 before leaving for the NBA, a move in which he considers to be the biggest mistake of his career, leaving Kentucky. But he coached Kentucky to multiple Final Fours, that 1996 championship that Mark Pope was a player on, and Pitino would have definitely been a splashier hire than Pope, but there is still a solid case to be made that at this point in 2024, headed into 2025, that Pope is the better hire. Pitino, had some highs and lows for sure at St. John's this past year, and again, it definitely would have drawn in a lot of attention, but would it have been the perfect fit at this point in his career and where Kentucky is trying to go? I guess we will never know, but that being said, Pope has been one of the less accomplished resumes that has gotten the job as head coach from Kentucky. He has just 2 NCAA tournament appearances in 9 seasons, 0-2 in those games, including losing that 6-11 game this season to a Duquesne program that was a bid stealer, would not have made the NCAA tournament if they did not gone on that run in their conference tournament. Pope has no conference championships in his career. He has had his team finish in 5th in the conference in each of the past 3 seasons. Now, this past year was BYU's first season in the Big 12, and they were ranked within the top 25 for the majority of the year. So I would personally at least give him a little bit of a pass on that sense, because this was a big ask for a Cougars program, switching from the WCC to a very physically tough Big 12 conference, and they absolutely held their own, showed they were a good team despite what happened in the NCAA tournament. But the 2 years prior there, they had finished 5th and tied for 5th actually in the West Coast Conference, where you look at the WCC and Gonzaga and St. Mary's are the powerhouses of the conference, making the tournament every year, and the idea of dethroning either one of them is a bit of a tall task considering the types of resources available necessarily at BYU in comparison to some of these other schools, especially Gonzaga. But they also finished behind Santa Clara both of those years, Loyola Marymount, and San Francisco in these seasons as well. So ultimately, Pope is definitely a little bit of an unproven, and I do sort of like the idea. I mean, we've seen at times before the way that some of these former player hires haven't really panned out. We just saw Juwan Howard, obviously the disaster that took place with Michigan, and they were forced to replace him this offseason. Pope shows a lot of promise. He's one of the younger up-and-coming head coaches. We'll see how this plays out for them. Again, Barnhart doesn't seem like he has that much left in his career as the athletic director, so it seems like this could be his last hire. Ideally, I'm sure he's thinking that he wants this to be his last hire of his career and things work out with Pope. I guess we'll have to see. Again, it is pretty hard not to succeed with the backing of the program behind them, being the Kentucky basketball brand, and I'm sure that the boosters are going to try and support their former Wildcat who helped deliver a championship a couple decades ago, and help him continue to... No, you lose out on the recruiter that John Calipari has been over the past decade and a half, but still, the brand is the brand of Kentucky, and I don't expect them to fall off a major cliff in that department. Curious to see if next year does end up being any sort of a rebuild. Now, Kentucky just missed the tournament as a whole a few years ago prior, and had not been to the second weekend in the NCAA tournament since 2019. So it's not like we are likely to see this massive drop-off, because although, yes, Kentucky has still been a relevant program, haven't seen the Sweet 16 in 5 years, and it seemed like there was just a lot of stagnancy. The fresh air with Pope there, again, the energizer that he is, does bring a lot of promise, and again, the sort of NBA-ready style, the NBA similar style that he coaches with can still be maybe a selling point to a lot of these prospects. It's not that Pope is any sort of an unproven. He himself made the NBA during his playing career briefly at one point as well. So, again, I think it's pretty hard to fail at Kentucky in terms of being a program. It's going to be all on that postseason success, though. He has 5 years to try and make it work. We will see. Hopefully, I think he's going to make it to the end of the 5 years. He's going to have a little bit of leeway here, but I also can't tell you that I would be completely shocked if this hire doesn't work out. But again, going to be interesting. For starters, how they end up recruiting. I've mentioned this a couple times in recent weeks. Very early in the recruiting cycle, but Kentucky had the number 2 class headed into next season. That is sure to be shaken up, I'm sure, to some degree. And is Pope going to be able to sort of upend the Kentucky recruiting the recruiters and who they're bringing in for next season and churn out a good class? I guess we will see. But on that note, we are going to be taking our second break of the show, and when we come back on the other end, we will be diving into the contract extension of Jrue Holiday from the Boston Celtics. So stick with us, and we will be right back.
Looking for your daily fix of sports talk without having to pay for it? GSMC Sports Network is available on YouTube. Just search GSMC Sports Network. Get your fix of daily sports talk shows on YouTube, absolutely free. NFL, college football, NBA, MLB, MMA, UFC, fantasy football, and so much more. GSMC Sports Network has shows running all day long, with new sports shows starting every 2 hours. Just like on your favorite cable sports channel, except GSMC Sports Network is absolutely free. Just search GSMC Sports Network on YouTube to catch one of your new favorite shows, like the GSMC College Football Podcast, Chip Shot Football Podcast, Hoops and Heels Women's Sports Podcast, GSMC Basketball Podcast, and so many more. Check it out for yourself. GSMC Sports Network, now available on YouTube absolutely free. Search GSMC Sports Network on YouTube right now.
Welcome back into the GSMC Sports Podcast. We're now going to be diving into the contract extension of Jrue Holiday as the Celtics continue to build up a very expensive payroll in hopes of winning another championship. This was a move that was announced on Tuesday, that Holiday will be with the team now through the 2027-28 season, a 4-year deal worth $135 million. Celtics brought in Jrue Holiday this past offseason from the Portland Trailblazers in the fallout of the Damian Lillard trade that sent Lillard to Milwaukee. And Jrue Holiday was initially going to be headed into this offseason with a player option worth $37 million. He was expected to probably decline that deal so that he could cash out on one big final contract. He's turning 34 in June, but instead he is under contract for the next handful of seasons, and he's going to be a lower cap hit for next year alone at $32.5 million. So about $5 million saved for the Celtics just in that sense. But the fact that his price is going to continue to rise over the coming years, and obviously you do have to take into consideration the new CBA deals, and the salary cap is probably going to increase as well. But Holiday is going to get up to over $37 million by that final season of his contract when he's going to be 37 years old. So that is a steep price. Again, we'll see what sort of effect the salary cap jumping has on a deal and how we view that in particular. But when you look at Jrue Holiday's season averages on paper, they don't particularly stand out as a 30 million plus player. Just 12.5 points per game, 4.9 assists per game, and 5.4 rebounds per game, under 1 steal per game for the first time in a handful of years. First time of his career, actually, as I look at this now. But I think that it goes beyond that. He is still an All-NBA caliber defender. He's been All-NBA defense the past 3 seasons and 5 of the past 6 seasons. He provides a level of flexibility on defense that does give the Celtics and any team that he is on a bunch of different options. Many times this year, they have had him take the assignment of the opposing team's big man. They've done so against Karl Anthony Towns when they played the Timberwolves earlier this year, against Joel Embiid, against Giannis, and others. This allows Porzingis to sort of float around a little bit more in that roaming big man position where he can help on various drives from the big man in an Eastern Conference where you have Embiid and Giannis. And typically to advance to the finals, you have to go through at least one of them. Porzingis was dealing with foul trouble early in the year as well, and Holiday has been able to, again, just provide some different looks at certain occasions that have been very valuable to the Celtics defense as they've become the number 2 team in defensive rating this season. He and Derek White are just a very, very good combination of perimeter defenders from the backcourt spots, where they're especially massive in getting back in transition defense. The Celtics are 4th in opposing fast break points, and that is in large part due to the fact that while you have Jason Tatum arguing on one side of the court after he didn't get a foul call, Jrue Holiday and Derek White are hauling back on the other side to get back and disrupt any type of a fast break opportunity for the other team. And also offensively, the IQ, the ball movement, not that his assist numbers are particularly high, but he consistently makes the right plays, and he shoots 60% on corner threes, which is in the upper 90% of players in the NBA. So he's automatic from there and provides a level of spacing that plays into a very 3-point centric Celtics offense as well. And you can definitely make the argument that this contract extension could end up being an overpay, but I do also think that when you're talking about the Celtics organization here, they do deserve credit from an ownership perspective to actually be willing to try and max out on their salary cap table in order to compete. They know they have a legitimate contender now, and they should for the next handful of years, considering their 2 main stars in Tatum and Brown are both in their mid-20s. Jrue is now on a 4-year extension. They signed Kristaps Porzingis to a 2-year extension when they traded for him over the offseason. They gave Jaylen Brown the max contract last year, and Jason Tatum is now due for a supermax this coming offseason. I will say, as a Boston sports fan, it's actually nice to see one of these organizations spending on their teams. The Red Sox have forever scarred me, I think, and the Patriots are one of the sneaky lowest spending organizations over the past decade. And now you have the Celtics and the way that their ownership is actually willing to spend to sort of help out the Boston faithful in that sense. I know not the most popular from a national perspective, but just something I wanted to point out there, as the Celtics are going to be one of the most expensive teams in the league headed into next season and for the foreseeable future. And because of that, they are going to be very much restricted with roster flexibility in these coming years with the newest CBA limits on what type of moves a team can make while over the second luxury tax threshold. A variety of different restrictions, such as not being able to sign any vets to the minimum, can't be involved in the buyout market, can't combine multiple smaller contracts in order to go and get a more expensive player. So they are going to be stuck with the group they currently have in large part for the next handful of years. But at the same time, you look at the Celtics roster and they do have some level of, none of these players are really aging to a point where they're going to be massively overpaid in my eyes, just based off of, if we're talking, and I hate to sort of throw other players under the bus, but a deal like Bradley Beal, where he makes a tremendous amount of money, has struggled to stay healthy over the course of his career, and yet he is on a $60 million contract. He's through the 2026-27 season. It's $46 million, just under 47 this year, and by his final season he's going to be making 57, so almost $60 million. And yeah, he's still only 30, so again, maybe unfair of me to throw a player like that under the bus. But we saw Chris Paul being on a very expensive contract before as well, really diminishing his value on a team. But for the Celtics here, sort of resetting, there are definitely questions about their depth. They have Derek White currently. He's under contract through next season. He's going to be eligible for an extension. Curious to see what they do. It would be pretty strange of them to pay $135 million to Jrue, who in a lot of ways plays a very similar game to Derek White, but is much older, and then to not pay Derek White. They have Al Horford, Peyton Pritchard, and Sam Hauser under contract through at least next season. Pritchard through the 2027-28 season as well. These have all been rotational pieces, so when you look at it that way, now a lot of people are concerned about the Celtics bench as it currently stands anyways, but that is their top 8 rotational players under contract for the next 2 seasons. So in terms of having to make these types of supplementary moves to add more to the team, if the team believes that those 8 are enough to run through a playoffs, they already have that. Now, again, after that is where it gets a little bit more dicey, where we've seen the way that the Nuggets have drafted in recent years, and that's sort of the level of contribution the likes of a Christian Brown and a Peyton Watson, to have some energy guys, some youth, can fit into the system that they currently play, that the Celtics should, if they want to, be able to add to their bench. That's probably the route they're going to have to go. They do have Jaden Springer, who they traded for earlier this year, was a project player with Philadelphia, and they're hoping that he can be a defensive guard. Still a little bit up in the air there. I am actually a fan of Jordan Walsh, who was a 5-star recruit going into college. His freshman season at Arkansas, he ends up falling into the second round, has spent most of the year in the G League because of a lack of being able to get actual minutes in the NBA, but if he can develop in a consistent jump shot, I do think that he can be a real rotational player for them. And the fact is, in today's NBA, you can't have everything. You can't have the perfect team. And we've seen that with the Nuggets. A lot of people are concerned that they are a little bit more top-heavy this season as opposed to last year, losing Jeff Green and losing Bruce Brown as well. But it's being able to find other ways to sort of manipulate the roster, and a lot of it falls on the scouting department as well, being able to hit on some of these later first round, possibly second round picks, which the Nuggets have done. The Celtics are going to have to sort of look a similar route if they want to continue to improve their roster. But as for the current core that they have, I mean, they are going to finish this season with they've locked it up for a bit now, but they're going to finish this season with the most amount of regular season wins, with a significant lead over the number 2 seed in the Eastern Conference. So in theory, again, these players should all be meaningful pieces for years to come. Now, if you are going to sort of poke at holes in this, Al Horford is only getting older, and he's a bench piece who has been sort of spotty in terms of how many games he's actually playing this year. They're resting him a lot on pretty much most back-to-backs, but he still played 65 games this season, and again, his production definitely not what it always has been, but that is an area to look if you're talking about the bench falling apart. Kristaps Porzingis is also somebody who provides a very important layer to their offense, but we've seen him be injury prone in the past. They've done a pretty good job of also sort of limiting his minutes this season to make it to the playoffs, but you always do have that sort of concern about something could possibly happen with Porzingis, and really those are the two big. And then Jrue Holiday, by the time it's the 2027-28 season and he's 37 years old and he's making $37 million, that might not look very good. At that point, I still don't think that with his game he is going to be a negative necessarily. He should still be able to be, at least at that point, a bench role, maybe provide some of the types of contributions that Kyle Lowry gave the Heat headed into this season, where there was a clear decline at that point. But, I do think that this is a statement from the ownership group that they are committed to winning and they don't mind spending the money, which, again, as a Boston sports fan, I do appreciate, because none of the other organizations, the teams in the city, are actually investing into their teams. So I like the move. I understand the concerns with it, but I was very for it, and it's very encouraging that they're going to have this starting core that's won 62, 63 plus games this season, and they're going to be running it back for years to come. But we are going to be taking our final break here, and we're going to be touching on a different contract extension in Josh Allen with the Jacksonville Jaguars. And I want to talk about the Jags and whether or not they can rebound from a disappointing end to last season. So stick with us, and we will be right back.
For the best and latest podcasts available anywhere, go to the podcast app on your cell phone and type in GSMC to access free content-rich podcasts on health and wellness, book reviews, sports, entertainment, relationships, social media, movies, technology, finance, and even weird news. Subscribe and download the GSMC Podcast Network's family of shows, available everywhere podcasts are found.
Welcome back into the GSMC Sports Podcast. We're headed into our final segment of the day where we're going to be talking a little bit of NFL here and the Jacksonville Jaguars, who just signed Josh Allen to a big-time contract extension. This was reported on Tuesday. Going to be a 5-year deal worth $150 million, at least up to that. $88 million guaranteed. They had franchise tagged him a month ago ahead of the deadline, and now they work out a long-term deal with him. Allen is coming off of a career year where he had 17 and a half sacks. Having that type of a season in a contract year can be a little bit of a red flag at times, but I thought this was a deal they had to do. I love Josh Allen. I think that even headed into this year where obviously 17 and a half sacks is very eye-popping, but I think he has been one of the more underrated edge rushers in the NFL, and now he's sort of finally getting the credit he deserves. He did an interview with the Jaguars media, by the way, and this was right after he agreed to the deal. In terms of the point I just made about handing out this type of a contract following a massive statistical year, he just basically talked about how hungry he still is. And yes, I know words are only words, but I think I buy it with him. He said, "I'm extremely blessed and honored to get this paycheck or to get these checks, but I still set goals for myself." Went on to say, "Defensive Player of the Year is my next goal. Winning the Super Bowl, being the MVP of it, I'm a legacy guy." He also said, "I have to win the Super Bowl and be the MVP. I'm not going to stop until I get that. That's motivating me. That's bigger than money." Allen was a first-round pick for them in 2019, 7th overall, and has been an absolute stud for them since then. He's been a key piece of their defense. I do believe that he has played, at least to some degree, a role in making Trayvon Walker's transition into the NFL a little easier. Now, Walker was obviously the first overall pick in 2022, and he was more seen as a little bit more of a project player. And last year he came back with a very solid season after a pretty quiet rookie year and recorded 10 sacks last season. And I think that the fact that Allen garners as much attention as he does on that defensive front, that frankly was, outside of their defensive ends and it's not the strongest of groups. Their interior D-line wasn't phenomenal, but the fact that Allen exists on that line also allowed Walker to maybe not necessarily be the number one focal point of when opposing teams are game planning. They can't just focus on making things as tough as possible for Walker because they have to worry about Josh Allen as well. And I think that this team is coming along very nicely. That being said, though, the Jaguars did have a disappointing season last year where they went 8-3. They went 8-3 and then lost 5 of their last 6 games and missed the playoffs. Now, I think at least some of that can be attributed to the fact that Trevor Lawrence was dealing with an injury down the stretch of that losing streak, where after going 8-3, the Jaguars faced off against the Cincinnati Bengals on a Monday night game, and they were tied with the Bengals in the fourth quarter when Lawrence went down with a very serious-looking high ankle sprain. He exits that game. They end up losing in overtime. Granted, they did allow 34 points to a Jake Browning-led Bengals team. So, as much as maybe I am trying not to make excuses necessarily for the Jags, but as I do sort of, I guess, let them off the hook a little bit, considering Lawrence's injury, the defense and really the offense as well were just massively inconsistent last year, and that showing against, again, a Jake Browning-led Bengals team was a very tough look, allowing the amount of points that they did. And they tried to force Lawrence back the next week through this high ankle sprain on a short week, which was probably a mistake. Lawrence came out. They ended up scoring 27 points in the game, but Lawrence threw 3 interceptions and really didn't look himself. His mobility was very clearly hindered, and even later in the season as well, he ended up missing a game with a shoulder injury that forced him to miss the game against the Panthers. Now, they ended up winning that game, but were 0-5 in those Lawrence games from there. So, again, a very disappointing end to the season after being one of the most talked about teams in the last offseason, where during the playoffs they pulled off the comeback against the Chargers. They pushed the Kansas City Chiefs and had a real chance, and yes, they did definitely let that one slip away a little bit as Mahomes left that game briefly with a high ankle sprain, I believe it was. But this was a Jaguars team with Trevor Lawrence in his second year were leaps and bounds better than they were the prior season after firing the disastrous Urban Meyer tenure and then going on to the NFL or going into the next season and hiring Doug Peterson as their next head coach. So lots of buzz around this Jaguars team. The playoffs for them, Trevor Lawrence made that big-time jump from year 1 to year 2. They were supposed to have their new star receiver 1 in Calvin Ridley, and their division was supposed to be weak in the AFC South before the Texans came out of nowhere to win 10 games and make the playoffs over them, and the Colts were actually also a competitive team as well, winning 9 games, and they should get Anthony Richardson back next year and in theory be able to improve. Now, could be a chance that a full season of Anthony Richardson does take a little bit of a step back before things get a lot better. Richardson does definitely have the potential, and I am in on him long term, but I wouldn't be surprised, that is, if he does struggle a little bit next season. But all that to be said, can the Jaguars bounce back for next season? I want to start by looking at what they did this offseason. Outside of this Josh Allen contract extension, they brought in Gabe Davis from the Buffalo Bills. He was probably the biggest addition, of course, the big-time playmaking wide receiver. They gave him a 3-year deal worth $39 million. Very explosive in some of these big-time home run plays. They bring him in, let Calvin Ridley walk, who ended up getting a ton of money from the Tennessee Titans. Ridley was their receiver in yards and was their leading receiver in yards and touchdowns last season. Both he and Davis were sort of inconsistent at times in certain aspects of the game. Like I said, Davis really relied on some of those over-the-top sort of home run swinging plays. Was a big-time touchdown scorer, which is a big deal when it comes to the red zone. They didn't necessarily have anybody who can go up and catch those fade type of routes. He is a good contested catcher, so I think that he can play a nice role in Jacksonville next season. Ridley, for as much as he had, I believe it was 1,100 yards and 8 touchdowns, he had more games with 40 yards or less receiving than he did with 100 or more. And I just feel like, you know, especially down the stretch of the season, granted, Trevor Lawrence wasn't necessarily himself either. Ridley probably wasn't worth the paycheck for the Jaguars, who are trying to contend. Now, I didn't hate it necessarily for the Titans, who are resetting, trying to make sure that Will Levis can be a guy for them. But for the Jaguars, I understand sort of letting Ridley walk and coming in with Gabe Davis, who might fit in their system even better, actually. Davis doesn't really have that receiver one potential, though, that Calvin Ridley does. And yet again, they just have a lot of very solid options in him, Christian Kirk, Zay Jones. They have Evan Ingram as well, who was top 5 in the league this past season in receptions. they could potentially benefit from adding another wide receiver in the upcoming draft. I wouldn't say it's their biggest need, but is something that I am a little bit curious about as well. On that note, I guess I would say that cornerback is probably their biggest need. They just brought in Ronald Darby, who spent last season with the Baltimore Ravens, and I thought that he did a particularly good job in the matchup against the Texans in the Ravens' first playoff game in the divisional round against the Texans. But still, I feel like that secondary group is a little bit on the weaker side, and they have the 17th overall pick, which is where a couple of these cornerback prospects, specifically, I really like Terrion Arnold out of Alabama. Nate Wiggins is somebody who could be in that sort of range as well. I'm also not sure, though, what the update is on Wiggins and his injury. He ended up leaving the combine after giving a blazing 40 time, ended up leaving with an injury. Wiggins was one of the most improved players in college football from last season to this year out of Clemson. So, again, just something I'm sort of looking at for what the Jaguars end up deciding to do in the draft this season. But they also signed Eric Armstead to a 3-year contract worth $51 million. Like I sort of alluded to earlier, the interior of their defensive line wasn't super strong. Felt like Armstead's reputation maybe in San Francisco preceded him a little bit in terms of what types of production he actually put out on the field. But he gets another opportunity here in another situation where there are some big-time edge rushers outside of him in Trayvon Walker and Josh Allen. Hopefully he can sort of re-find some of that energy that he had in the seasons prior, where before his injury he was a big-time game wrecker, and he could prove to be a big addition for the Jaguars this year. And then finally, the last couple moves they made that I wanted to sort of highlight before giving my final thoughts on this are bringing in Buffalo Bills center Mitch Morse in free agency and re-signing Ezra Cleveland, the guard who they traded for from Minnesota at the deadline last year. The offensive line is another area where they could probably work on a little bit. It's fine, it's just not great either, so another area they could address in the draft. But I was very high on the Jaguars headed into last season. I thought that they could have finished as one of the top seeds in the conference, and it looked that way for over the first half of the season, but things really fell apart down the stretch there. And there is a real issue with the consistency. Even when they were still having a good season, there was a couple really concerning games. The first one, and granted this was before we sort of knew how relevant the Texans were going to be last season, the Jaguars ended up getting smoked by Houston in one of the first weeks of the season. They lost that game. It was 37-17. They had the Chiefs game in week 2. That seemed like the Chiefs were just begging the Jaguars to take that one. This was before the Chiefs had really reared its head as the team we ultimately saw in the Super Bowl. But this was a Chiefs team that was really struggling on offense, and the Jaguars just weren't able to get it done on that side. They had a blowout loss to the 49ers a handful of weeks into the season. So I find it sort of hard to imagine the Jaguars are going to be bad once again, but I believe their win total is somewhere around 9.5 games. Now, I think that on paper they should be better than that, and I do believe in Trevor Lawrence. He hasn't necessarily lived up to that very high draft expectation that he had surrounding him as he entered the NFL. A lot of people were saying that he was the best quarterback prospect since Andrew Luck in 2012, and I do think that there are still a lot of positives surrounding Lawrence, and he has tons of weapons around him as well to try and capitalize on that. The roster is very talented, and I think that they should be a playoff team. I think could be a little bit overlooked based off of the noise that the Texans have made both from last season and the offseason this past year. Again, that secondary is somewhere where I look they could definitely address as well. The offensive line has names, and granted, it is a little bit of a situation where we see a lot of the times that these free agent moves don't necessarily pan out the way that we expect. Brandon Scherf, who they got out of Washington in free agency a couple years ago, has not been the all-pro self that he was when he was with Washington. Now they bring in Mitch Morse, who is a very well-respected center in the game. Is he going to be able to keep up his level of play moving forward? All of this is definitely interesting. It's hard to necessarily predict whether or not a team is going to make the playoffs when we're in April. We haven't even had the draft yet. But I do expect the Jaguars to be a good team again. And as long as Trevor Lawrence is actually healthy and playing, I think that they can maybe surprise people more than, and at least overachieve expectations from the way that they are currently really being viewed in NFL fandom. But that is all we have time for today. Thank you very much for tuning in. Thank you to the GSMC Sports Network for allowing us to host this show. Just a reminder to like, follow, subscribe wherever you keep up with us. Follow our socials to get extra content as well. But that is all we have for today. Have a great weekend, and we will see you 2 o'clock Eastern on Monday. We'll see you then.
Let's go. I wake up to a little bit of drool on my pillow, feel like it's gonna be a bad day. Yeah, I'm tired of shit, and the coffee ain't hit yet, damn ain't